Great.
And we are now live, and I'll say hello as attendees start coming along. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of Democracy Journal, and this is our third installment of Talking Democracy. And we are pleased to be joined today by Jamal Simmons. Jamal's a writer and political commentator whom I've known for a long time, and he's been around and done some great things. And he just wrote this piece for us for our website, which was just a remarkable piece, an astounding piece of information that I had no idea of, that our other editors had no idea of, and that I think very few people knew much about. And I'll let him tell you. Jamal, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Mike, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure. It was good for me to write for Democracy. I remember when it was first started by those crazy kids, Andre and Kenny, almost a generation ago. So it was fun to be a part of it. So yeah, after the George Floyd murder a year ago and Breonna Taylor and companies started talking about how they wanted to deal with systemic racism and they were going to wrestle with it inside their own companies and externally, I started being asked by a lot of friends to take a look at this. I was doing these Zoom conversations like a lot of us were doing last summer. Yeah. And so as companies released this data, I just kind of was keeping it around. I'm a little bit of a pack rat, so my wife had to put up with piles of newspaper in the corner, like with this stuff, and I started keeping links. And so I started to look through the data, and what I noticed is it's almost like it elevated from the page. I began to notice some of the numbers were remarkably similar across sectors and across companies. And so
we should tell people these data were describing what?
They were looking at job diversities inside of companies, inside of companies. And so it's interesting because people describe diversity a lot of different ways. What I began to be concerned about was Black inclusion, right? Particularly at the leadership table. And I defined my universe by thinking about the institutions that were the pivotal institutions in American society, the ones that kind of, set the direction for everybody else. So it's a little bit of an elitist framework, some might say. But, I've been around politics for a long time. I've worked for CEOs. I know how this works. I've been to some of these schools. And the reality is, if the New York Times writes something on the front page, it'll end up in the Akron, journal. Or if it turns out that CNN covers something all day, somebody in Phoenix will cover it, in a local news organization. So I began to think about how this all fits together. So to wrap all this up, what I noticed was African-American inclusion kept showing up at around 4%. Sometimes it was 3.6%, sometimes it was 4.5. But if you think about it like a parking lot with 100 spaces, all the cars, or most of the cars seem to be clustered around space number 4. Right. So it's not a hard ceiling. It's just that they all seem to be hanging around space number 4. And so then the question was, why is it that that's all so much the same? And I kept, investigating to figure it out.
And this is the corporate world, the legal world,
corporate, law, publishing, military, academia with Black tenure professors who are really, if you know anything about colleges and universities, if you don't have tenure, you're just kind of a guest on campus, right? The people who have, even people who are president of universities will say the deans are more powerful than the president and the faculty are more powerful than the deans in many cases.
So everywhere. So
everywhere.
For all of this talk about inclusion and diversity, and I'm sure people are genuine about it when they talk it, but the Black participation at elite levels of all these institutions tops out at 4%. It's remarkable.
It is pretty remarkable. And so, you wonder why that's the case. How do you fix it? And that's what I tried to go into in the piece a little bit.
Yeah. So let's go into that. Why is it?
Okay. I got a pretty good piece of advice as I was doing this research from a friend who was a business school professor who said, you should look into threshold diversity, psychology in particular. But there are a lot of people in business schools who try to study culture and culture change. And one of the ways, a lot of it's kind of defined in this in groups versus out groups and how do you make culture and what's the impact. But when it regards race, there are a few things that show up over and over again. One is this idea of the groups have this feeling of threat of outsiders who are coming in. So think about like neighborhoods that we all probably have learned about. The one that my dad grew up in, where he was the first Black family that moved in there in the 1950s. He said when he went to high school, the high school was mostly white and Jewish. By the time he graduated from high school 4 years later, it was mostly Black, right? Like there's this idea of tipping points. And so we all are familiar with this you know, and maybe there's this idea of there's an unconscious tipping point that happens inside of companies where people begin to think like, oh, people have a sense that we've got just enough Black people around here for it not to change very much, for everything to mostly stay the same. We can have diversity, but we don't really have the culture change.
Yeah.
And
yet we can still say, and yet we can still say, but we're diverse.
Yeah, exactly. We're reverse. This idea of prototypicality, right? Like I'm the person, you know, and we all have this. Listen, I'm a dad now, and I'm thinking about how I deal this with my kids, right? Like the experiences I felt that were good, I want them to have some of the same experiences. So in all organizations, people think the way they got to the top, the way they got to leadership is the model way. And so we start thinking about other people giving them similar experiences to get there. The problem is when you think about race and bias in the system, there's so much bias in the plumbing. We talk about pipelines. There's so much bias in the plumbing that it's very hard to find African Americans who are going to check off all the same boxes as as the white talent pool that shows up.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think? We'll get to solutions in a second, but I guess you know, I'm just curious. Like you talked about it a bit, but what does it tell you about these institutions that's the number? You know?
Yeah. What it tells me is about society, right?
Yeah.
I think we spend a lot of time thinking about witch hunts, right? We spend a lot of time looking around for who are the bad actors. Let's go and punish the bad actors, and then we'll all be okay after we go get them. The reality is, it's a sorcery minefield, right? The witches are everywhere. And so this idea that we're just going to punish a few bad actors and then we'll all get back to business, I think that's not right. One of the reasons I wanted to write the piece about the continuity is that it's important to recognize this is societal wide. And so it's a systemic issue, and we're going to need some systemic solutions to try to solve it. There are a couple of professors, or actually 4 professors two from Columbia, 1 from NYU, 2 from University of Pennsylvania, who talk about, in this diversity threshold idea, they looked at women on boards. I thought this was incredibly important. They looked at women on boards, and they found that companies for a long time had 1 woman on a corporate 500 board. But then people started thinking like, wait a minute, why is there only 1 woman on this board? Like, that's not enough. So they exerted a lot of what they call a negative scrutiny on these companies. And so then the companies looked around and they talked to their peers, and they decided to imitate their peers. And what happened was they went from having 1 woman on a board to be more likely to have 2 women on a board. So they went from tokenism to toucanism. And these professors predict at some point there'll be threecanism because people will decide that 2 isn't enough. So now we have to have 3 women on a board. And so their prediction was that because of how companies make these decisions and leaders make this decision, they imitate their peers, they look around for norms, and then they try to do just enough work to escape negative. And then they stop trying, right? That you would end up with a very homogeneous level of diversity across these backgrounds. And that's what happens. And they looked at it not just for gender, but it also shows up in race. So for me, that's the important point is we're going to have to come up with what we mean by diversity when we say it. And what level of it do we think is important? And how do we measure that? How do we measure what's important? And then who's going to kind of be the police, right? Somebody's got to go around and be the cop that says, hey, wait a minute, you didn't get to where you're supposed to go. You got to do a little better.
Yeah. So do you think 4% is shockingly low? But do you think even 4% of elite leadership being African-American, does that change an institution, a white institution, in a significant, meaningful way?
Look, in some ways it does, in the sense that, and let me also say this, we are more diverse, right? We are more diverse than we used to be. I think that is undeniably true. Sometimes though, that diversity means that it's not more Black though, right? Like, And if you think about the history of America, the fault line in America, social fault line has been the black-white fault line.
Yeah.
And it is also true that when we try to address that black-white fault line, we tend to do things that benefit communities broader than that, right? So you think about the 14th Amendment, which had the Equal Protection Clause in it. People have used that for a variety of things, women, LGBTQ. The civil rights laws in the 1960s had a lot of immigration law in there that has benefited immigrants. Affirmative action has also been helpful, to women in particular, as well as others. So when we attack the black-white problem, we tend to benefit a broader group of people. It doesn't always work that way in the reverse, right? If we try to do things that benefit the broader group, we don't always help African Americans. And so that fundamental schism is still the black-white fault line. So I think we got to pay attention to that. And we look around, this question of police brutality, people being killed, who haven't, unarmed people being killed. That's really at its heart, most often a black-white problem. It's not always, but it's most often a black-white problem. So if we're going to wrestle with that systemic racism, we really do have to have more people around the table. In the leadership cohort I talk about, the American leadership cohort needs more Black people with skin in the game, frankly, in resolving this question of systemic racism, or else what's going to happen is sort of like this Fortune report that came out the other day, that of the $50 billion pledged to deal with systemic racism and all these questions last year, only $250 million has been spent or committed so far. Wow. A year later, they can only pinpoint $250 million has been spent. And so, you got to have some stick to itness in order, if we're going to fix these problems. I think having more people at the table will matter. Lastly, I'll say this: we saw this question come up in Georgia around the voting rights bill.
Yeah.
And people wonder why big companies like Delta and Coca-Cola didn't have more people speak up. Just cursorily, like, I'm not even looking at the raw data. If you go to Delta's page where they list their leaders of their company, dozens of people, not a single African-American among them, right? Coca-Cola, dozens of people, 36 of them, only one African-American who's a general counsel. So you begin to ask the question, why is it that these companies didn't speak up when a question like this voting rights thing came out? It might just be that nobody was in the room when the decisions were being made about what to do, who really felt passionate about getting it done. Or if the one person did feel passionately about it, there was nobody around to back them up.
That's right.
And over time, like all of us, we live in a social structure. Nobody wants to always be the skunk at the garden party. Nobody wants to always be the ones, scolding everybody about what they didn't do. Yeah. So you pick and choose your battles about when you want to, push on something, and when you're going to I'll just have to ride this one out and wait till the next battle and see where it goes.
So we tell ourselves a story about diversity, about our commitment to diversity, that's an optimistic story, I think, liberals anyway.
Yeah.
And, you turn on MSNBC and CNN and it's diverse.
It is now.
Yeah, it is now. Yeah. It wasn't.
It wasn't 10 years ago.
Until pretty recently, right? Yeah. But we get these cues from the culture that tell us an optimistic story about this. But when you really look at boards, partners at major law firms, it's just really a lot hasn't changed.
No, a lot hasn't changed. I mean, one of the firms I point out is Paul Weiss, which is where Jay Johnson is a partner there.
Right.
It's where a bunch of people are there, but it's viewed as a leader among law firms. And Paul Weiss has 6 African-American partners out of 144 in their last year's report, which is, 4.1 or 2%.
Yeah.
Supreme Court, which is incredibly, we think of as being, it's the highest court in the land. Law clerks help decide on so many of these cases. Supreme Court law clerks between 2005 and 2018, there were 487 of them. Only 20 of them were African-American, right? That's less than 5%. So, it's not that many. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's not ideological. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was an icon, a lion of liberalism and progressivism, she had one African-American Supreme Court law clerk in 25 years. So this resistance to having African-Americans at the table, and this is a great point. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, half of her law clerks were women. So she did have
So
a
she
more
was
diverse,
conscious.
yeah, she was conscious of this.
Yeah.
They just
Right.
weren't Black women,
Yeah.
right? So which is very often the question when you talk to feminists about this, right? You wonder why Black women and white women have this wrestle about feminism. It's because very often when feminism is talked about, it ends up being white women who are put at the table, not Black and Latino women,
Yeah.
who won't argue, like they would count in the gender number.
Yeah.
I've had this conversation
Yeah.
work. And once to me, I was trying to figure out why not. We're fighting against the old boys club. I'm trying to get more women here. I said, well, Black women count. And she kind of got mad at me for, you're being too hard on me. I'm trying to do the right thing here. Like, okay. But this is the wrestling that we have to do as we become a more diverse society, that this is only going to become more important work that we have to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Is anybody doing any great work trying to change this, at the Supreme Court or at law firms or anything like that? Or what needs to be done?
I think more people are going to can report about the state of play in terms of the DEI work, as they call it. There are some people, diversity, equity, inclusion work. There are a couple of green shoots, right? Larry Fink at BlackRock has now pushed his companies to try to step up and report out more. They want to have some more data on climate change, issues of diversity and governance, gender. They want to call it talent management, human capital management. But then just this week, we see that at Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett pushed back a share initiative that wanted to get the same thing done. He pushed back and had it killed. So it's not going to happen at Berkshire Hathaway. They're not going to push their companies to have these kinds of reports. So, for everything we get, there's something that we give. It'll give you one more green shoot. So the U.S. military, we think of Colin Powell. We'll talk about this in the piece. Colin Powell as this icon for having been the Joint Chiefs of Staff chair. Today, there are 41 commanders across all 4 branches who could be in line to be Joint Chiefs of Staff chair. There are only 2 of that 41 who are African American, and frankly, there are only 3 of those 41 who are not white. And so there's a real question about that level of diversity. So you get from 43% of the military is people of color, 17% of the military is African American, but only 4.9% of the leadership of the military.
Mm-hmm.
The Marine Corps has never had a 4-star general ever in its existence. Helene Cooper's been reporting on this a lot. Now there's an African American colonel who's being promoted to brigadier general. Mm-hmm. He is someone people think is in line who could be a leader, commandant of the Marine Corps one day. But the questions that people bring up about this guy are things like, well, he just doesn't seem like he's he's working well with others, or he's too hard charging, or he's got he pushes in ways that make people uncomfortable. Well, he's a goddamn Marine. Excuse my language, right? Like, we think if nobody in society should have to be hard charging, that shouldn't be a ding. It should be a Marine. But that old culture fit thing pops up even in a place like the Marine Corps.
Mentioning him makes me think of General Austin, our defense secretary, and just the Biden cabinet and upper level appointees more broadly. How do you rate the job Biden's done along these lines?
It's fantastic. It's phenomenal. It's I think it's better than any would have thought going. It's really a positive thing. I think, the General Austin question is a good one, because I went back and people called me. It's funny, you write one of these things, people start calling you, giving you more data. And I got this as I was calling around initially. Someone sent me the article from Clifford Alexander. He wrote a piece in the New York Times back in 1997 about Colin Powell, and how in the late 70s, he was the first African-American Secretary of the Army. The generals brought to him a list of colonels to get promoted. There were no African Americans on the list. Yeah. He said, why aren't there any African Americans on the list? There's got to be somebody in the entire United States Army that deserves to be promoted to be general. If he's, and so they went back, and Colin Powell was the name that ultimately came to him, and he made him the first general. This is incredibly important, because this gets to the solution. It's not just about putting good candidates into the pipeline. You've also got to have leaders that are at key junctures in the pipeline to make sure people get pushed and prodded along. And so if you've got good people, but nobody's willing to acknowledge them, then it doesn't matter how many good people you put in. Al Sharpton once said to me, he said, you know, civil rights may not have given you your resume, but civil rights made sure somebody looked at it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that is a place where having leaders, this is why I talk about leadership at these institutions. Leaders matter if we're going to solve this, because you need people who are paying attention to help even the system out and make sure the bias is getting corrected along the way.
We have 10 minutes left, and I always like to broaden these conversations out.
Yeah.
Since the series is called Talking Democracy, let's talk democracy. Let's talk about the relationship between race and democracy. I think you'd agree that our democracy is under threat right now. One of the aspects of that is these efforts to suppress votes of, obviously, mostly of Black people, Black and brown people. You know, where do you see, when you wake up at 3 a.m. and think about the condition of our democracy, what do you think about?
I think about this. This is the question for me, because, you know, again, I've worked with leaders my entire career, from Bill Clinton and Barack Obama through like cabinet secretaries and candidates, and how to get the right rule makers. You need the right people around the table when these rules come up for debate to figure this out. And so there's one that's not included here, but there's this came out during the Obama administration, a great piece of work some journalists did, that there are a lot of high performing, low income students in the country who don't get chances to go to the most elite schools. And there's a variety of reasons why. One of them is the recruiters don't come to their high schools to come get them. And most of them are white, by the way. Most of these kids are white. The recruiters don't come to their high schools. The counselors don't think to apply. So, you know, I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. So, you know, somebody would say to them, oh, you're a great student. You could probably get a scholarship at Michigan State. It's a great school. It's fine. You should go to Michigan State. But nobody says to them, you know what, you might be able to go to Harvard. Like, let's apply to Harvard, right? Oh, or maybe they say, let's go, you know, maybe let's go to Michigan, right? Like that to them, that seems to be the ceiling. So I just think, like, we've got to make sure that people up and down the ladder are getting a shot to get in, because I feel like what's happening is so many people feel like the American dream is slipping through their fingers, and I think that's driving a lot of the animosity that's occurring in the country. And so if we don't help, this is not just racial, but it is partially racial. Mm-hmm. If we don't help more people who are not in the inner sanctum of elitism get access to the ladder that could lead them to starting a company, you know, running for office, getting a executive job, if they don't see a pathway for themselves to the traditional ways that, you know, people rise, then we're all going to get screwed, because they're going to lose faith in the system, which we're starting to see happen, and we're only going to have more conflict over time.
Yeah. Well, you know, we've seen a lot of that over in recent years. Are the elites responding to that frustration in any kind of way?
I think Joe Biden is.
Mm-hmm.
So there's two things that happened. One, I think Barack Obama got it, but they were uncomfortable talking about it very directly, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think he was trying to treat the symptoms of the problem, but not really getting people focused on the root. Yeah. Donald Trump kind of ripped the sheet off the thing, for lack of a better word, and said, like, you know, this is what's happening. I'm on your side. All the elites are screwing with you, particularly the government elites, and I'm going to be your champion to take on all of these folks. I think what Joe Biden is doing is a different and more helpful thing, which is that the system has got these kinks in it, and I'm going to be the guy, and my team, we're going to get the kinks out of the system fast enough to get something to you, right? So when you see them doing money for child care, taking care of children's $3,000 tax help for families, you see that happening. That's like real money, real chicken in a pot for real people, that says, slow down, wait a minute, we can make the system work in a way that will benefit you. And I do have to say, this is a challenge to my friends on the left. We spent an entire campaign talking about how to fix things for people: healthcare, free college, Medicare for all, not just healthcare. Medicare for all was a particular thing, and free college. Nobody was mentioning $3,000, or I think it's maybe a little more than that, but $3,000 ish payments for children and families, right? Nobody mentioned that really in the campaign. So we got something that's going to get, I don't know, some huge percentage of families out of poverty because we pass it, but we didn't talk about it. But yet, if you weren't for Medicare for all, if you weren't for free college, you weren't considered to be a true progressive. I think we got to be a little less doctrinaire on our side, and be willing to say, we've got some good ideas. If you've got some other good ideas, let's put them in the table. But my idea is not the only idea that makes you a legitimate progressive partner or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think they're going to be able to pass some version of a voting rights bill in this Congress?
I think it's hard to know. I think the answer is some version. The question is, where are the teeth? Where are the teeth? But the politics feel like they are moving in a direction where even some of the Republicans who recognize what's happening in these states feel like we need to set some sort of a broadly small d democratic standard here for citizens voting in the democracy, and that mattering, that ought to count for something.
Yeah. If anyone watching wants to send in a question, please do. We have some time left. Yeah, but talk a little bit more about this. I mean, it's, to me, that's the biggest thing. If they can't do something to protect voting rights, then the 22 election looks not so good. The 24
Right.
election looks not so good. And whatever progress is being made in these first 2 years is just likely to be snuffed out. I mean, why can't they all just, why can't they all see that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think this question of preserving the democracy I do think is the fundamental question. But it's two questions though. It's the legal structure, but it's also the social environment that enables the legal structure. And that's the thing that I think Biden in the short term I think he's hammering hard to get as much to people to say, we can make the structure work. Give us time. We're going to figure out, what do they say? Shots in arms, dollars in pockets, right? And so we're going to do what it takes to get them to work. Now the question is, how do we preserve these laws? And so much of it is state driven. I don't know about you, but I've spent some time around some state capitals, and that's not the state capitals are not the place that I want to drive all of the decision making in America. Yeah. you think that Washington is corrupt? You haven't spent enough time in state capitals.
What are you working on next?
So we're putting together a podcast, which should be coming out soon. We're actually having a meeting about that this morning, which is just broadly speaking, thinking about this sort of new generation of Americans, and how is it that we focus on these questions of getting people access to the economy and the social structure, and then we're going to keep writing and looking at these big political questions. I got to tell you, I think who on the Republican side, a lot of my liberal friends get mad at me because I still think that we gotta to find a way to encourage the small d Democrats on the Republican side and enable them. I know that they are a dwindling bunch, but if we are going to save the democracy, we need some conservatives who are in the fight, and we can't all be fighting each other when our real enemies are outside, literally the barricades.
Name one.
Name one. I mean, look, I think like the Lisa Murkowskis and Romneys, and these folks. We start with the folks who voted to impeach Trump, the folks who voted to go along with the election results. You start particularly in the Senate, some of these governors. I think that those are people who at least are willing to take some risk to try to preserve the democracy, even at great political risk themselves. So I'll give them a little room to operate.
Are you in the Trump's influence will fade camp, or Trump isn't going anywhere and he's what it's all going to be about in heading into 2024 camp?
I think Trump will do whatever it is he wants to do, and he can convince somebody else to pay for. Right. And I think as long as he's healthy enough to show up somewhere and he can get somebody else to pay the bill, sure, why doesn't he run again? I mean, it's the greatest ego exercise of life is running a presidential campaign.
Please
And
read.
that's dangerous, right? And one is Trump's dangerous. Two, Josh Hawley is probably even more dangerous than Donald Trump is, because Josh Hawley is like Donald Trump with discipline.
Yep. Please read, if you have not, the 4% Ceiling on democracyjournal.org by Jamal Simmons. It's a really eye-opening piece, and follow Jamal's work wherever else you see it. Jamal, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.